So Professor Kimberly Breedon is a visiting professor of law at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. She's an independent legal scholar working on the constitutional dimensions of government corruption. She teaches a number of courses, including constitutional law and statutory interpretation. Prior to serving as a professor, she was a federal clerk at both the district and circuit court levels. Please join me in welcoming Professor Breedon.
So thank you, Whitney. Thank you, Whitney, too. Thank you, Sean. I just want to add my word of thanks and compliments to the entire Law Review staff. You guys have been absolutely amazing. The attention to detail and personalized care that you have brought to this entire endeavor is unparalleled in my experience. So thank you all for that. And thank you also for the swag bag, including the handwritten thank you notes. That was quite a nice touch. I also want to extend my thanks to the other presenters for such important and thought-provoking, insightful presentations on this topic of barriers to the ballot box. And finally, I want to thank you, the audience, for sticking to it until for the very end, for the very final presentations, because this topic really is a critically important one. And I guess one of the things that strikes me in learning more about the barriers to the ballot box is that most discussions about impediments to the exercise of the franchise focus understandably and appropriately on commonly recognized obstacles. Excuse me, things like voter ID requirements, voter roll purges, limitations on early voting and absentee voting, felon disenfranchisement, voter registration impediments, gerrymandering, and disinformation about voting procedures, requirements, and locations. And so we've heard a fair amount about many of these topics today. My co-author, Chris Bryant, who unfortunately could not be here with us today, but he sends his regards. My co-author and I believe that there's yet another significant and yet underappreciated barrier, and that is that the inaccurate counting of ballots after the votes have been counted, or the perception of inaccurate counting, also pose barriers to the ballot box. We argue that the electronic voting irregularities, or the perception thereof, play a role in undermining public faith in the integrity of our elections, and that conflicts of interest, or the perception of conflicts of interest, or appearance of conflicts of interest, of public officials who are entrusted with ensuring the integrity of the systems and procedures for accurate vote counting, contribute to distrust in the election outcomes. Joseph Stalin famously said, "I consider it completely unimportant who will vote or how, but what is extraordinarily important is this: who will count the votes and how." Now, he made this statement in the context of party voting, but nevertheless, we think the lesson from Stalin's authoritarian view of vote counting is important for our present predicaments or circumstances. For purposes of our essay, what's important about accurate vote counting is twofold. Election outcomes must be based on systems and procedures that are trustworthy. That is, the systems and procedures themselves must produce outcomes that accurately reflect the will of the voters. And second, election outcomes must be based on systems and procedures that are trusted. That is, the systems and procedures must be trusted by the voters to actually produce these outcomes. We advance in our essay a discussion on a sort of a 30,000-foot view of the issues relating to accurate vote tallies or the perception of accurate vote tallies. And we talk about the theoretical and constitutional implications, current practices and vulnerabilities in our electoral systems, election officials' potential conflicts of interest, and proposed legislative fixes. So there are a number of theoretical and constitutional implications of vote count integrity. Excuse me. First, it is a requirement for a healthy democracy. It's an essential component for realizing the central promise of popular government, namely that the largest portion of the electorate will control the selection of representatives. So it's key to democratic self-governance. And it also acts as a check on government corruption. Sometimes voting corrupt officials out of office is the only direct remedy that the public has to obtain redress for corruption by government officials. And corrupt government officials often seek to disrupt the mechanisms in place for holding them accountable. So that to the extent that vote tallies are vulnerable to manipulation, elections may fail to serve their function of checking government abuse. The Supreme Court has recognized the importance of vote counting. In Westbury versus Sanders, the Supreme Court said, all other rights, even the most basic, are illusory if the right to vote is undermined. And in United States versus Classic, the court said, obviously included within the right to choose representatives secured by the Constitution is the right of qualified voters within a state to cast their ballots and have them counted. Emphasis mine. All right. But accurate vote counting isn't enough, right? The public must also believe that the vote tallies are accurate. And in fact, public doubts about vote count integrity may ultimately prove as destructive to democratic processes as actual tampering. A distrusting public may experience long-term disaffection with the political process, disengagement from public discourse and political campaigns, and alienation from both government and the laws it seeks to uphold. Is Ms. Ravel still here? No. Okay. So this is building on that, that notion of not believing that your vote is important, not believing that your vote counts, and the potential dangers to democratic self-rule that flow from a populace that believes its vote is meaningless or ineffective. It is a primary goal of authoritarian foreign regimes to undermine public confidence in Western democratic elections, and specifically, as we have seen recently, in United States elections. Malign actors seeking to interfere with electoral processes are generally of two types. Those that seek to actively manipulate the election itself so that their preferred candidate is illegitimately declared the winner, and those that seek to undermine confidence in the vote so that a defeated candidate can protest the outcome in a way that prompts at least doubt in the general populace. In these cases, changing the outcome is not necessary to jeopardize the perceived illegitimacy or the perceived legitimacy of the election. So in light of the dangers to long-term health of democracy, all reasonable efforts should be undertaken to secure the integrity of vote tallies and also to secure the integrity of vote tallies against suspicion of tampering or suspicion of malign interference or domestic corrupt interference for that matter. And so with that, we turn to sort of the current practices and vulnerabilities in our current system. Every jurisdiction has its own mechanisms and systems and processes for allowing the votes to be cast and then counting the votes, and then in some cases providing for audits of the votes. In many of our jurisdictions right now, we have old and poorly functioning electronic voting machines. The electronic voting machines are more vulnerable to tampering than are the traditional paper ballots. Electronic voting machines are essentially of two types: optical scan machines, where the voter records his or her choices on a paper ballot and then feeds that paper ballot into an electronic machine that scans and tallies and records the votes digitally. And then there are also what are known as DRE, direct recording electronic machines. And in those machines, the voter registers his or her vote on an electronic device of some sort. The interface with the voter is electronic, and then there is a digital capture of the vote. Some of these machines provide a paper record of sorts for the voter to review and verify the choices that have been recorded by the voter. Some of the machines don't have any paper trail, and some of the machines produce a barcode as a paper trail. Usually the barcode also includes English written language of what the voter has registered as his or her vote. So some jurisdictions use paper ballots, some jurisdictions use paper ballots with optical scan machines, and some jurisdictions use purely electronic voting machines. Jurisdictions also vary in terms of the post-election audits that they conduct. Some jurisdictions require post-election audits. Other jurisdictions leave it up to various public officials to make that determination. There are two kinds of audits that are relevant to our discussion. One is just the traditional audit. In the traditional audit, excuse me, in the traditional audit, there's a review of the ballots that are cast in a fixed percentage of voting districts or voting machines. And the audit is conducted by comparing the paper record to the results produced by the voting system. In the traditional post-election audit, the number of ballots to be counted remains the same, regardless of the margin of difference between the votes for a losing candidate and the votes for the winning candidate. Sometimes the audits the traditional post-election audits are conducted manually in their entirety, and sometimes it's a hybrid approach where they're partially conducted manually and partially conducted electronically. The second kind of post-election audit that is relevant to our discussion is known as a risk-limiting audit. And a risk-limiting audit is sort of a spot check between the actual paper ballots that have been cast and the digitally recorded or electronically cataloged results of those ballots. So in a risk-limiting audit, state officials select a sample of paper ballots, and that sample is usually based on the margin of difference in the outcome. And they compare those sample paper ballots with using statistical methods to the digitally recorded or electronically cataloged results. The risk-limiting audits also select what's known as a risk limit, and this is the percentage chance that the audit will fail to catch incorrect results. So for example, an audit with a risk limit of 5 will have a 95% chance of successfully catching the incorrect vote. And risk-limiting audits are also good for determining whether or not a more comprehensive recount is needed. So some jurisdictions conduct traditional post-election audits, some, very few, but a few, conduct risk-limiting audits, and some jurisdictions don't conduct audits at all, at least not as a matter of course or a matter of requirement under the law. Now, cybersecurity experts and election security experts agree that the best way to secure the election, to secure the integrity of vote counts and the perception of integrity is to use voting systems that rely on hand-marked, voter-verified paper ballots, auditable paper trails, and post-election risk-limiting audits. But several jurisdictions rely on electronic voting machines. They don't have voter-verifiable paper trails, and they don't require robust post-election audits, let alone risk-limiting audits. There are some states that are currently in the process of purchasing new systems, or they have decided that they are going to continue using these very technologies that present these precise problems. So given the fact that cybersecurity experts and election security experts almost unanimously recommend these best practices, it sort of begs the question of why state election officials are in making their decisions not following these best practices. And there are a number of reasons for that. Cost is one reason. Updating old machines or purchasing new machines can be costly. States don't always, I shouldn't say states, jurisdictions don't always have sufficient funding to make these upgrades or to purchase new equipment. But there are also problems of conflicts of interest involving vendor contracting and oversight and audit authorization and supervision. So for example, there are a number of let me rephrase that. There are a number of campaigns which have received donations from voting machine vendors. So we have, campaign contributions as one potential conflict of interest. There are also a number of public officials who, shall I say, enjoy revolving door relationships with potential vendors, right? Either the public officials themselves or their staff go and work for the vendors after leaving the public officials' employment, or there are vending machine vendors, staff who come and work in government for the very campaigns, or the officials for whose campaigns they have contributed to. Right, so we've got these revolving door relationships. And then in addition, we have at least one voting machine vendor that has created what it calls an advisory board of election officials from various states, designed ostensibly to give this particular voting machine vendor feedback. I mean, maybe it's unfair to say ostensibly, but at least that's the asserted reason. Maybe there are other reasons, but the advisory board members are these public officials who participate in the customer feedback, but also in the process enjoy lavishly funded trips to places like Vegas and New York, and they get to go see live events like Alexander Hamilton, and they don't learn the lessons. And so we've got funding of this advisory board as another potential conflict of interest. And these conflicts of interest lead to distortions regarding the purchasing decisions or the upgrading decisions about the kind of machinery to buy. And they also lead to distortions regarding public officials' decision-making when it comes to authorizing or supervising audits, in part because vendors claim proprietary interests in the hardware and software that they are selling and that they say precludes independent forensic analysis of the vote tallies. So we've got this problem with conflicts of interest, or in some cases it's simply the appearance of conflicts of interest regarding the kinds of machines that public officials are buying, public election officials are buying, and whether or not to order audits or supervise audits in cases where the officials themselves may have a vested interest in the outcome of the audits. So there have been a number of proposed fixes to these problems, and we see these primarily at the federal level. Mostly in 2018 and 2019, there were several members of Congress, both in the House and in the Senate, who introduced, in some cases, bipartisan legislation to address a number of the issues relating to public confidence in the voting systems, or the election integrity itself. Now, we take no position on the power or the propriety of federal legislation in the areas coming within the scope of the proposed provisions. But instead, what we want to do is consider the type of intervention that state, county, and local authorities might use to address the problems of perceived illegitimacy of electoral outcomes caused by public officials' conflicts of interest or appearance of conflicts of interest. So what we've done is take a number of the provisions that have been set forth in the Prevent Election Hacking Act of 2018, the Protecting American Votes and Elections Act of 2018, the Secure Elections Act, and the For the People Act of 2019. And we've pulled from these various provisions a list of recommendations that we think are worthy of attention from state, county, and local officials for consideration in their selection and upgrading and administering of various voting machines and election systems. Right, so obviously, one is to provide funding for updated and fully functioning voting machines. Second, we recommend voter verifiable paper ballots and auditable paper records. Third, we recommend mandatory post-election risk-limiting audits, and you'll notice that these are consistent with the gold standard recommendations of cybersecurity experts and election security experts. We also recommend mandatory transparency and public accountability procedures and reports so that the public knows what's going on. We advocate for strict anti-revolving door rules, stringent multiple-year campaign finance disclosures, and strict election official recusal requirements. The last recommendation comes because we've seen in two states, at least two states, well, 3 states actually, in the last election cycle, we've seen candidates running for office who are also responsible for overseeing the integrity of the election. And in some cases, the integrity of the election has been called into question, creditably so, right? So we saw this in Georgia, we saw this in the Georgia gubernatorial race, we saw this in the Florida gubernatorial race, and we saw it in Kansas, and I believe that was for a federal Senate race. That may have been for a gubernatorial race as well. My old brain is not functioning at the moment, and I don't remember that particular detail. But the long and the short of it is, recusal requirements are important because the very people who were entrusted to oversee the integrity of the elections had a vested interest in the outcome of any recounts, of any audits, of any criticisms of the types of election machines or electoral machine, voting machines and electoral systems that they had adopted. So what's at stake in all of this? Well, we argue the stakes are actually quite high. We argue that to the extent that voters find, well, let me back up, to the extent that the electoral processes, that the voting systems are not trustworthy, and or to the extent that voters don't trust the outcomes, on the basis of the voting machines, electoral systems that have been used. Nothing less, perhaps, than whether government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. So I began with Joseph Stalin. I end with Abraham Lincoln. I think that's a positive note to end on. And so I had no idea. I don't see a timekeeper anywhere. And so I don't know. Oh, there you are. Hi. So I assume I'm well within my time. Okay, so I'm happy to take your questions or... Yes.
What are your thoughts about hand-marked paper ballots like OptiScan versus a voter-verified paper audit trail where you use the touchscreen, you use the DRE, but it spits out a hand copy that you can compare, and then the voter feeds it into the scanner?
So I think probably what's important is not what my thoughts are, but what the election security experts' thoughts are. And my understanding is that, first of all, to the extent that there's any kind of computer electronic related recording, most of them deem that insufficient as compared to the gold standard.
The gold standard being OptiScan.
The gold standard being hand-marked paper ballots that are also then hand-counted, but that's not really feasible. So the OptiScan is sort of the next best approach because at least there is a voter-verifiable paper record to be compared against the digitally recorded record. The DRE is sort of one step removed from that. And the reason for that is when the voter registers the vote electronically, it's possible that the digitally recorded record is actually different from what the machine spits out on the paper trail. And without some sort of forensic auditing, there's no way to know that for sure. So that's a less secure.
That's a great help. Just one quick follow-up. I don't want to dominate the time. Just really quick.
Yeah.
We live in a county, like many large municipal counties with a large population, in which there are many different city council, county commission, state legislative districts. So there are maybe 100 different ballot faces. So during early voting, when the voter can show up to any satellite early voting location and ask for their particular ballot, regardless of where, there's an argument that, well, we can't do second best OptiScan because it would be too difficult to be able to spit it out. Now, I know there's something called ballot on demand technology where you're supposed to be able to print it out. What's the consensus on that? Is that a valid objection saying, oh, I'm sorry, we can't do OptiScan or not?
That's a great question. And I actually am not familiar with that particular permutation. So that's something that will be a really useful topic for me to explore, hopefully before the final the final iteration of this paper. I think that probably the objection relates to the administrative costs more than the technical feasibility of it, right? Because it seems to me the technical feasibility of it shouldn't be that hard. Honestly, I mean, I don't know how many voters come at any given time to these kinds of voting centers, but it seems to me that it shouldn't be that hard to just print, each time a voter comes to this location to print whatever the appropriate ballot is, have a printed paper copy that the voter then completes and then enters into the OptiScan machine. It doesn't strike me as something. And again, I personally am not an expert in this the technological area of this, but it sounds to me like they're really just talking about minor differences in cost and inconvenience. Although, if you've got thousands of people showing up at any one time, it might be more complicated than scores of people. So,
I have a question.
yes.
So we talked about cyber issues and cybersecurity. What are election officials doing? Because technology keeps going quicker and quicker. We have a big election next year. And you're saying earlier that there are jurisdictions that are not using the audit process or not using the best practices. How easy would it be for an entity to hack into those and throw the whole election, with that being the common occurrence in some of the jurisdictions?
So I can't give you a percentage answer about how common it would be. What I can tell you is that the cybersecurity experts do deem those sorts of vulnerabilities to be sufficiently important that they have testified before Congress, they have written open letters, they have really pressed our legislators to find ways to fund and at least encourage, if not require, machinery that is less vulnerable to hacking or tampering. And part of the problem is, you can talk about remote hacks, or you can talk about software that has malware encoded in it. And so at any point in time along the chain, whether it's a software upgrade, whether it's downloading the votes from a machine on a USB stick and then, or some other device, and then reinserting that device into another system. Anytime there are these contacts, these electronic contacts, there is opportunity for malign actors to tamper with votes. And so it could be that we're talking about deleting vote records, adding vote records, flipping votes, and so there are all kinds of different ways that malign actors can get into the system. The other problem, though, is the trustedness problem, right? And so here we are talking about our vulnerabilities in our voting systems, and to some extent, what that does is say, well, even if in a given jurisdiction, the chances are very low that a particular election will be tampered with, the very fact that it could happen gives us pause, right? Causes concern. And in fact, I had a conversation with a student earlier this week who told me that her husband lives in Georgia, and he came very close to not voting at all in the 2018 midterms because he didn't think his vote was going to count. And she said, is there any way I can find out whether it did? I have no idea, right? So I think that, there is a burden on us as voters to hold our election officials' feet to the fire and ask what they're doing, right? The best way that we can preserve our democracy is to be actively involved in it and to understand what the stakes are.
And then just to follow up,
sure.
In the Bush-Gore case, where they had an issue with the actual paper ballots and the hanging chads, and then during the Florida recount in Broward County, and you have these people sifting through thousands or hundreds, however many, what would you say about that?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up because that was actually the impetus for moving from paper ballots to electronic ballots and our electronic machines. And so, obviously the butterfly ballots and the hanging chad ballots are not necessarily the best approach. But there was another issue in that election that sort of went under the radar that really wasn't talked about much, and that was that at some point during the night on election night, I believe it was Volusia County, but I can't remember for sure. So Al Gore was ahead by a huge margin, and then at some point during the process, that margin got flipped, and there was some evidence that there were two different memory cards that had been used that, and no one could explain why there were two different memory cards to record these votes and upload these votes from one system to another. And so I think that one could make the argument that the move to electronic systems was an overreaction to Bush v. Gore. But at the same time, we do have a problem, or did have a problem, with the butterfly ballots and the hanging chads, and so maybe there's a better approach, and maybe it's the hand-marked OptiScan approach that solves that problem at least. Yes?
I have been curious, this is obviously not something that would happen anytime soon, but about the possibility of online voting. Obviously that would create a whole set of new problems, but it would also solve a bunch of problems. And I wonder if there's any research being done into something like that. I mean, we do lots of very important things online as it is. Is there any possibility of moving voting online as well?
Yeah,
in the future?
Certainly I think it's a possibility that can happen, but I can also tell you that, at least it's my understanding, that the cybersecurity officials and election security officials are like, no. No, that is the worst. That is the worst of all possible worlds from an election integrity perspective, simply because of the opportunities that it leaves open for malign actors to use vectors to tamper with the votes in some way. But you're right, it would solve a number of the other problems. And so, that's a good question.
So it seems unlikely in our era, as a practical matter, that we're going to go back to paper ballots nationwide.
Do you mean hand marked and hand counted?
Yeah, do you agree with that? I mean, that's not ever going to happen, even though it does seem more secure.
Ever's a long time.
But don't you think it's going to get less likely to happen with each advance in technology? I just don't see it ever.
Potentially. I mean, I guess one counter argument could be that if our electronic systems become so insecure that we just don't trust them at all, then maybe we go back to the Stone Age, which again sort of sort of militates in favor of the hand-marked OptiScan approach and this hybrid approach.
So that was kind of a premise to my next question. Has anybody proposed a comprehensive technological solution? Would it be better to have, a uniform technology-based system, or would that be even worse because then you'd only have to hack into one system rather than, I guess, many?
So one of the things that some of the proposed legislative fixes called for is for Congress to establish, I can't remember what exactly they call it, but a panel to establish best practices, and that they would provide money to the various jurisdictions for coming into compliance with those best practices. But because we are such a hodgepodge of voting jurisdictions, and each jurisdiction is sort of a fiefdom in its own right.
In a way, that's kind of a defense to widespread hacking.
Absolutely, it is. And so the answer to your question about whether there's like this one standard approach or recommendations for a single standard approach is so far, again, no, other than recommendations that we have hand-marked paper ballots with paper auditable trails and risk-limiting audits. But again, those are just sort of best practices suggestions, and there's not been any top-down authoritative requirement or recommendation. Okay, so we have 5 more minutes for questions, but I think this might be a good time to break and move on. Okay, so thank you.